Commence primary ignition.
I'm just not the hero type, clearly.
What a piece of junk.
Enterprise, this is the captain.
I got a bad feeling about this.
It's all part of the plan.
Engage.
Welcome back to Podcast 2 for 1. I'm your host, Donovan Thompson, with my co-host,
Daniel Wingfield.
In today's episode 212 of Podcast 2 for 1, youtube.com/@2for1 studios. It's the best place to consume all the content. And if you didn't know, listeners, and let's be honest, you probably did not, we are sponsored by Kapow Comics, located at 4047 East Kill Avenue. I know. I'm all kind of messed up. There they have comic books, collectibles, graphic novels, and of course, special guest appearances throughout the year.
Kapow.
Wow. And if you're on the YouTube, then you would know that we are greeted by the one, the only Dr. Bruce Hutchinson. And today we're talking the French, or if you read the title, yes, the thumbnail.
That was a necessary addendum. I just had to add that in.
It's okay. Why not? We're starting strong, and we're talking about. We've already watched it. I hope The French Connection, 1971. Hugh Jackman, Gene Hackman, and Rob Schneider. My brain's all kind of messed up.
I mean, that's a perfect.
It's like
what Gene Hackman, Hugh Jackman. You just watch
that's
the
kind of
J
wild.
and the H, and basically.
Anyway, we were discussing, listeners, the last few we decided the French Connection after watching Alien and Aliens, and we decided to do it on that. So I'd never seen it before. And I just want to kind of get everyone's thoughts on it. And I'll start with Daniel.
Well, Bruce is about to jump in.
Yep, Bruce, please take over.
I was first of all, I'm happy to be back again. But I was just gonna say, after we had watched the first Aliens and we'd kind of gone back to maybe older movies than we had done, I thought, we did a older but still contemporary science fiction movie, so it would kind of be fun to sort of go, okay, what's an older but still feels like contemporary sort of new Hollywood versus old Hollywood action movie, not like the stiff stuff from the 30s and 40s and 50s. Not to say that there aren't great movies, Hitchcock and stuff like that, but so The French Connection just seemed like a natural choice of like a kind of a contemporary but older action movie, and be fun to see like how well it holds up to today's action standards and everything like that. So I'm curious to hear what everyone thought too.
Daniel?
I'd never seen it before, and it was really nice to watch an old movie again. Just the the 70s acting that you got in some of these kind of films that just felt so much less exaggerated at times, in a way that feels like more normal and more realistic. That is just something that is nice to revisit. I feel like movies today, or at least, we still get them, but they're like indie films. I feel like that you get this kind and style of acting a lot of the time. Anyway, I really enjoyed it. It's a really interesting movie, especially the ending. I think it just completely just caught me off guard, the abruptness of it. Is this based on a true story?
It's inspired by.
Sort of. It's sort of inspired by like some drug cases and some real cops and stuff like that.
Okay. So the epilogue was like a fictional one, I guess, for the characters in the film.
So, yeah.
So it's got an interesting cast of characters, none of which are very likable. I think it's an interesting portrayal of police work, and of Popeye in particular is just a very interesting character. My wife and I just finished watching The Wire, my second time, her first time, like last week. And there's a lot of parallels. There's a lot of similarities between how they depict policing and policemen, and like whether they're good or incompetent, or whether, you know what I mean? And like all these levels. Anyway, really enjoyed it. I think there's a lot to talk about. But it was, again, my biggest thing is I think it was just nice to watch an old movie again in this way, and I know we did with Alien and Aliens, but I think even just getting out of, science fiction and fantasy settings, getting to like a movie set in the real world of the time that's an older film is just, it was just nice. And I think that, I've got a lot more to say, but I'll save it for later discussions.
Yeah. first off, I've always been a huge fan of Gene Hackman. And anything he's ever been in, I've always loved him in it. And I remember multiple times while we were at UCA, whenever we talk about card chases or whatever, when that time would come in the part of the semester, I remember seeing pieces of this card chase, and I never really had any context for it or what was happening. I just remember that was kind of used as an example. For a great card chase, and also just kind of how they were doing things that just weren't quite the norm yet. And I just have the suspicion that while I'm watching this, kind of like when you watch Citizen Kane, and the fact that some of these things you're seeing are very trivial today, because you're like, oh, of course we see that all the time in movies, or we see this all the time in movies. And I have a suspicion that a lot of the things we get thriller wise, or even kind of like a neo noir or realistic documentary action sense, we got probably from here. Like, this is one of the first movies to kind of do that. That's my, you can tell me if I'm wrong, Bruce, but that's my suspicion. Because you look at the date, you're like 1971. This is early. And like when I think of the 60s, like you said earlier, it's much different in terms of their framing and how they're staging action and those kind of things. And I was just kind of going back and looking at some of the movies I've seen prior to the 80s. I've seen a healthy amount, but I just had a feeling this was an innovator. And I didn't even know that Rob Schneider was in it. I didn't know that that this had been
Roy Schneider.
Roy Schneider. What's wrong with
Is that
Dave
Rob
Boys? I don't
Schneider's
know.
dad?
Yeah.
Is it?
Okay, Roy Schneider. No,
Scheider.
surely
Okay.
not.
Scheider.
Scheider.
Roy Scheider. Okay.
Schneider.
It's been a long week, Bruce. Very long week. And so I saw Deadpool Wolverine 3 times. I'm still coming off that high. So yes, Roy Scheider from Jaws fame,
Yes.
of course. And so anyway, I was very surprised to see him in it. And yeah, it was just nice to watch a movie that felt like I was in that time period. I was in New York or wherever it takes place, and I am experiencing it just felt real. Like, you look at a movie like this, the most obvious example all three of us experienced with Deadpool Wolverine. It's fun, it's got all these fun things in it, but none of those characters feel like they come from the real world, right?
Yeah.
And when you watch Gene Hackman's character, Popeye or Doyle, you're just like, wow, like it looks like that guy was just plucked off the street, and no wonder he won an Academy Award for it, especially looking at all the other movies around him. Anyway, I had a really good time watching it. I think there are some interesting things in there about the way it ends and just its overall structure, but I had a good time with it, and I'm really glad I got to finally watch it.
It's got that real handheld feeling too. I think that's part of the cinematography style, that handheld style. And as I was watching it, I'm assuming in the early 70s that wasn't very prevalent, but I'm sure it had been done a few times. But it just seemed like a lot of it too. Like, most of the movie felt handheld, almost outside of just some basic just shots. But it did have that very much like New York felt so real. And like if you told me they were just filming amongst just regular New Yorkers and none of it was extras, I would believe you. Like, you know what I mean? Like, it had that just I don't know, the crowds, the streets, everything about it was just, and I just thought like the cinematography really captured that well. That I agree. It felt like a very realistic movie. And it's interesting, Bruce, you brought up it as an action film, because I that's not to me what I connected with it as, and like, I think like Donovan, it's more of like this noir realism.
I think it's like an old-timey Born Identity,
thriller,
honestly.
A little bit. Yeah.
Yeah,
But
there's hints of thriller, there's hints of cop
Yeah.
procedural, there's a little
Yes.
hints of action as well. So yeah, I mean, it does have, there are parallels today, maybe when I say today, I mean contemporary, last 20 years, like Training Day or
sure.
Uncut Gems is another movie. That sort
maybe.
of feels it's a bit of a mishmash of genres. So you're right, it's not like a full-on action movie. It certainly has action elements that we'll talk about.
Yeah. Anyway, I again, it was another nice change of pace. I know we've been hopping around to random places sometimes. I feel like on the journey we've been on reviewing these on the podcast, and I think honestly, even after seeing Deadpool and Wolverine, while I enjoyed that film, there was something really nice about this as like as a different flavor. You know what I
Yeah.
mean?
A
It's like
palate
in
cleanser.
contrast to that. Yeah, yeah. I'm just like, this is just like a classic film and just feels in so many ways uncomplicated.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And I
Yeah.
think that was just nice. And so, yeah, I'll let it be.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
hadn't seen it in a long time, and I loved it. I mean, I thought it was absolutely fantastic. For all the reasons you guys have said, I mean, going back to sort of that really gritty kind of style that we don't get as much anymore. Not to say that it's gone completely. Obviously, I mentioned some movies that still fit that, but everything is so sleek and polished these days that having
Yeah.
that grittiness of performance, of location. But at the same time, you mentioned all that handheld, but like it's smooth. Like, I mean, there's shots where I was like, that looks like a Steadicam shot,
Sure.
not a handheld shot, but Steadicam hadn't been invented yet, so like the work they did on that was so good and so innovative. Um, and I think you guys are right, if you go back 5 years, 6 years from that movie, you wouldn't have seen anything like that. But you really had, I think the French Connection really grew out of the new Hollywood cinema that came of age, in the late 1960s. That was very much influenced by the French New Wave, where everything was looser. You could get away with handheld. You could get away with things being sort of dirtier and less clean and less polished. And you had movies like Easy Rider, and stuff like that I think sort of set the tone a little bit. And so it's weird because it's gritty, but at the same time, everything is so well executed and so well done, and it's almost like the perfect merger of that the life that like the French New Wave and the new Hollywood was bringing with Hollywood craftsmanship and people really like knowing their business and knowing their tools and being able to execute at a really high level. And when those two things come together, you just get this, this wonderful sort of crackling, exciting movie, which I love. And we'll get into the details, but like Act Two is them just like
The whole thing.
tracking these guys for like 45 minutes. Like it feels like nothing's happening and like it shouldn't be exciting, but sometimes it's thrilling. I mean, we'll get into it, but when Popeye is chasing the guy Alain and they're getting on and off the subway, like we've seen a little bit of that now, more
Sure.
recently in other movies. But the way like everything is so fluid and so well executed, and the cat and mouse game between these characters is just fantastic. That you're just hooked, even though it's just like again almost a standard procedural. They're just like
Yeah.
watching these guys and staking them out and following them, and you just get totally engrossed in all of it. So yeah, I obviously there'll be some interesting things to talk about with the character of Popeye and with the ending, but um, yeah,
Yeah. Whenever I watch movies with like unique things like that, like you said, it's kind of such a long act too, where we're just watching these guys watch people basically, and kind of like you said, the cat and mouse game. I'm always in my head like, how do they know? Like when they read the script, they're like, okay, typically I would think like, okay, this needs to be 30, 40 minutes long. Like, how do they sit there and just think we got to have 30, 40 minutes of chase of like people outside buildings, looking inside people's buildings, and then like the camera movement and those kind of things. And I would just like to be there and just see like what their thought process was and like terms of because they do what we do, right? Even more so than like they're editing in their brain and they're probably thinking like how this is going to connect together. And I'm just like what didn't make the cut? Did everything make the cut? And just what I would like to just sit down with them and be like, what were you guys thinking and how did you think this would work? Because it does work.
yeah,
It's kind of it's very ballsy. And I feel like the 70s is always these just grittier, nastier movies like Taxi Driver and those kind of things. And you just get this
Yeah.
like really slice of life, like of the darker side of humanity. And I'm always impressed by their discipline and just their I guess I'm sure there's tons of movies out there where they're trying things that don't work and we only know about the ones that did, but I'm always like I'm not sure I could be like, okay, this will be a 30, 40 minute thing of walking around. I'm not sure I could think I could pull it off.
Right,
Like
right.
it's really
Well, when
impressive.
when you think about it on paper, if you're talking to
I'm
someone through
saying.
this movie before they're going to watch it, you're like, okay, now's a 45-minute chase sequence. You're like, huh?
Mostly
What?
on foot.
Mostly
What?
on foot.
Have we connected to the characters yet? What are the state? You know what I mean? Like, there's these, you're right in so much that like it 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 takes what is, I think, like kind of an unremarkable plot, right? Like an uncomplicated, straightforward, just kind of by the numbers plot, and keeps you engrossed the whole time. And um, I do think the cinematography is a big part of that. Obviously, I think Gene Hackman is a huge part of that, and just his performance as this really complicated police officer. That it's like I think these days when we're kind of in not a post-police society, but we're looking at police and policing and how we've depicted police in media very strongly, more than we ever have. And there's things that get thrown out, like terms like propaganda, right? Like Law and Order is your classic propaganda. The cops are always right. The cops will deceive people into being honest, and we're supposed to root for that. You know what I mean? There's so much of that, and then there's this that in like an era of when you would think like cops are like the kings of in the like policing was very strong, and the idea the power it held in the communities, and then you have this depiction with Gene Hackman, and again I'm like, that's part of what reminded me of The Wire, even because I think it's just this like we're following the good guys, but only in like good only in like technically they chose this profession, but
The
like
thin blue line, as they say, right?
yeah,
Between
like they're
cops and
not
criminals.
especially Popeye. He's pretty despicable. You know what I mean?
He's got
Like
tunnel vision. Yeah.
yeah, and just kind of seems like headed for destruction no matter, like he's just kind of like a ball of chaos. And anyway, I just thought that was just a very interesting element of, again, watching this in the 70s and kind of what I might have expected police depiction and like that to be like. It was a much more interesting take, a much more nuanced take.
Cool.
Last thing I want to say before we hop into it, is that only 6 years later, Superman, or I guess it was 8 years later, Superman the movie came out, and he was Lex Luthor, and he's like this really extravagant, like
Right.
comical character. And I just want to talk about how fun of an actor he can be. And he's done a lot of things I really enjoy over the years, especially in the 80s and 90s. And yeah, I think he did great in the role. And sometimes less is more, and I think that really applies here in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
All right, boys, let's dive into it.
Yeah, this movie is really interesting in a number of ways. Um, just looking, so I'll just sort of lay out. I saw it as a pretty typical 3-act movie. The first act basically running about 32 minutes until the captain basically approves that they can, wiretap Sal. To me, was sort of like the Act 1 climax. Pretty, like, not a huge climax or anything. Two things really stand out to me in Act 1. First of all, there is basically no inciting incident to this movie, which is really fascinating. And it's kind of a lesson because I think it works. But it becomes sort of a character thing, so we sort of are introduced to, Popeye and his partner Buddy. And it's funny that Roy Scheider's name is Buddy, which sounds like a nickname, but he also has the nickname Cloudy, which is just a really weird, interesting touch. I was like, wonder what his first name actually is. But they seem to be on some sort of, well, first we start in France, and so we actually sort of meet the bad guys. And so one, I think, of the really interesting things, I'm sort of jumping all over the place, is the amount of cutting back and forth between what's happening in France with the bad guys and what's happening in New York with the good guys. And it does help create suspense and helps us keep wondering, like, what is going on and how is this happening? But in terms of that inciting incident, like Popeye and Buddy just like bust some guy, and it's a little unclear, but it seems like he confesses that he might have killed a cop. and then they have that phrase about, did you pick your toes or something, or at least try to kill this cop, and then the guy sort of admits it. But it's almost like a Bond movie where it's like the end of the last case, right? It's like, okay, they haul him in, and now it's great, and now
they go out for drinks.
Yeah, Popeye's
right?
like, let's go out for drinks. Isn't it? Is it Buddy's birthday? Is that why they're going out for drinks, or do they just go out for drinks? Anyone remember?
I think he's just trying to get him to like celebrate the case or something like that.
Yeah.
But he is they.
There's some good banter also.
The humor too can be crap. This is another example of it. He's like, drink this, and he's like, whip it out, and he cuts. You know what I mean?
Right.
Which I thought was very, it's like, I thought that was probably
that felt modern.
Unique for the time.
Yeah, that felt modern. Yeah.
But so they go to this club, and Popeye's just like scanning the crowd, looking for suspicious things, and then he sees Sal with these other suits and decides that there must be something going on. Maybe he already has this in the back of his head. Like, the movie doesn't really tell us, but maybe he has already gotten a piece of information that's led him to bring Buddy to this bar.
That was my brain.
It's really
I thought it was Beverly Hills Cop, right? Where Axel F is going to the bar and they think it's like a thing, but he's actually there doing surveillance. So my brain was telling me, like, does he already know someone's going to be there? So
it felt like that to me too. But also there's a line in the movie that I'm pretty sure comes later that if it just come right before would have fixed this, which is like the line from the captain where he's like, you guys bring in the most bust, but it's like, low level, just kids with joints in their socks. Like, if that conversation happened before they go to the bar, and then this is like, you're like, oh yeah, this is obviously him trying to level up, trying to find a higher, find the, but you're right though. It feels random, but it also, I think in the context of who his character is, it just feels like, it almost feels like he's looking for trouble. He's looking
100%.
You know what I mean? Like, he wants to find stuff to do.
Well, yeah, and it's obviously he has no life, right? I mean, the movie shows us, and you alluded to this earlier, like, we don't know anything about these people other than what they do on the job. Like, there is no home life, there's no nothing. This is purely them on the job, and you really get the sense that that is Popeye's life. You get the sense that Buddy maybe has a little more life, but Popeye has no life other than copping. So, he goes to a bar. Whether he has some prior information or not, he's just copping. And then like 12 minutes in, he tells Buddy, hey, I think those guys are suspicious. And that's our inciting incident, right? It's him just deciding. And then they follow them, right? Like, they literally,
like, the rest of the night, like the whole night, right? I love the interaction. He's like, what if we give those guys a tail? And Buddy's just like, motherfucker. You know what I mean? Like, just that, like, not again. Like, you know what I mean?
Yeah, so it is kind of a great lesson in the sense that, like, you can have a pretty minimal inciting incident, and I think, like you guys said, if it tells us something about the character, if it reflects on the character, it can actually be really interesting and compelling, and we just sort of flow right into the movie without even realizing, that we're kind of in it, and then suddenly we're in it, and now we're in a new case. And the movie's underway, and we've got this goal, right, where they're trying to figure out, is there something here, right? Because we're just going off of Popeye's gut feeling, right? And so now it's like, is there something more substantial? And at the end, it's interesting. We get, I think this will lead into sort of the next thing we'll probably want to talk about with Popeye. They go bust up that African-American bar, and he has an informant in there, right, who says that there's sort of talk of a shipment, and that's all he's got, but he puts those two things together, and that's what he's basically able to convince the captain that they should, continue to pursue things,
Yeah. I feel like the moment where you're pretending to, I don't think he's completely pretending, but I think, like, your informant, like, you're like trying to rough them up, and then you put them in a different room, and then like you're actually like kind of somewhat friends or cordial. Right. I think that did that start here. I've seen it in tons of movies. You know what I'm saying? Like, was that something?
And then where do you want it at the end?
100%. Yeah.
Like, you're right. That's cliche now, right? That's seriously, yeah, right. It's cliche now, but like, You're right. Well, when did this start here?
Yeah,
I don't know if it was the
that's-
first one, but I'm sure it was fresher then. Yeah.
Yes.
But clearly the other thing we're getting in Act One is what a bad guy Popeye Doyle is. Like this is not a good guy. And
He doesn't want us to like him. I don't
no,
think.
and I
yeah.
think when you first watch it and you're watching it as a contemporary audience and you hear him using all these racial slurs and epithets, you might go, oh, this is just a dated movie. But I don't think it's because the movie's from 1971. I think we're very much supposed to, even in 1971, see Popeye as, if not a racist character, certainly willing to act like a racist whenever he wants, just to push people around to make them afraid of him, which probably makes him a racist anyway, but you know what I'm saying? Like,
right.
They had that one line where he's like, well, F black people, and he's like, well, F everybody. And it's like the one line where they're kind of like, well, he's maybe not racist, but he just is a horrible person to everyone. He's racist to everyone.
Well,
he's not racist to anyone in particular.
Just use
so it's
the N-word. He uses slurs against Italians, against Irish people, against Spanish
incredibly
people.
sexist, and and
of course, we get this reference constantly. He's sort of got this cop Mulderig, which is a sort of a weird name. Who doesn't like him, who's constantly bringing up that he got this cop killed previously, presumably the one that he mentions in one of the opening scenes. And then he gets Mulderig killed at the end. He kills him himself.
Doesn't even blink.
Yeah. Just immediately starts reloading. What I mean? And then the movie seems to just kind of, even the epilogue is like they were transferred to a different department.
Yeah.
And it's like, oh, okay.
But
right.
he definitely fits in with, I don't even want to call him an anti-hero, but just, he's just a bad guy. He's not supposed to be likable. We're not supposed to be rooting for him. We're just seeing a case unfold. I think that's the idea. We're sort of caught up in the case. Buddy seems like a better guy, except for he's totally enabling everything that his partner is doing, and he barely objects to anything. Occasionally he tries to tell him to cool off, and he does sort of play the intermediary once in a while, but basically lets Popeye do whatever he wants. And when you think about cinema history and you think about the movies before that, sort of to Daniel's point earlier, you might have seen film noirs where there was dirty cops or where there was people who were morally questionable. But I mean, this is just taking it to another level, right? In terms of who this guy is and whether it's because he's obsessed with the next crime or whether he's just because he's a horrible person or both or whatever. He's such a unique character. But yeah, obviously we're not supposed to like him.
Yeah, he's a wrecking ball. He's just he's got tunnel vision. And it's what's interesting too is, as Daniel and I have been working on these scripts, and as we talk about all these movies and stuff, we're always like, well, what's their motivation? What's this? And he doesn't really it doesn't seem like he has an inherent motivation other than just there's nothing else. Like,
he
right?
Can't
Like
stop.
that's,
he
can't stop. It's an addiction.
And I don't know, maybe we get to this later, but he ultimately fails, kind of, right? And like, it versus the antagonist they set him up with, the one that he was kind of squaring off with, he doesn't catch him. He missed.
Yeah.
He missed. You know what I mean? Yeah. And like I think it is interesting that, like, you're right. It doesn't want us to root for him, but we are aligned with him. We are with Popeye more than anyone else. It's his movie, and so like we are experiencing everything mostly from his POV, except when we were with the antagonist. But yeah, it is very interesting. I don't know his character in general, but I think, a movie doesn't always have to be saying something, right? And I think sometimes we try to read too much into it. But I think when they're playing with this much nuance, you do feel like there's there is themes that are going on, and just it's like, I wonder, is the movie saying like bad policing doesn't work? You know what I mean? There's a lot of interesting layers to it.
Yeah.
But
I think
in a minute.
A couple things. One, I accidentally found out about the ending because I was like, as I was watching it, I was like, just looking at a little bit of information, like because it was just this long chase thing, and so I was like, "What's about some of the production stuff?" And then I saw French Connection 2, and I was like, I read, I was like, "Oh, there's a second one," and I started looking at it like, "Oh my God, it gets away in the first one." So I ruined that for myself,
Yeah.
first of all. Second of all, I don't know though, and this is kind of maybe jumping to the end. I don't know. Post story conversation. I don't know if people would enjoy this movie as much as we do. I think we're engrossed in this medium, right? We respect the history. We've learned about the history. We know all, French New Wave, Italian realism, all these things, and we kind of appreciate it, and we can kind of step back from Deadpool, Wolverine every now and then, and look at some of these older things. I don't know if people would like this movie today without that kind of motivation, without a reason to anchor themselves with the character, and with the abruptness of that movie too. I don't think people would like it in particular, but maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah, it's an interesting point because even moving from like the 80s to now, I mean, you could go back to the 80s, to those B action movies with maybe with Arnold or Jean-Claude Van Damme or Steven Seagal. And there's no interior life to those characters, right? I mean, even Indiana Jones, as much as we love him, doesn't have too much of an interior life, but at least he has a romantic life, right? So there is something more to him.
He does
But
feel.
you're right. In the 2000s,
there's a goal. Like with Indiana Jones, it's romanticism for that character, right? And you want him to succeed because he's such a cool guy and he wants to preserve history. With Arnold movies, there's typically an inherent like he wants to save his daughter in Commando, save John Connor in Terminator. I mean, like there's always something there. That even if it's very simple, there's something.
But you're right. But even more in the 2000s, I think you're right that we've become used to internal motivations, that there are external goals and internal goals, and we expect sort of that I always say this in my classes, that external equals structure is the plot of the movie, and internal equals meaning is where we get the emotional resonance of the movie. And yeah, I mean, there's nothing internal at all about this movie. And you're right, maybe audiences would be turned off by it. That's a really great question. It is executed really well, and so maybe it would be limited to cinephiles. I still find it just an exciting movie, so I still think that people who would be interested in that genre of movie would still enjoy it. But it's a really good question. It's a good point.
There's an interesting parallel between this and I was listening to a podcast so I was recently reflecting on Tenet by Nolan, a movie that is structurally sound, production levels off the charts, cinematography level amazing, but as far as emotional connection with any of the characters, I mean, the protagonist's name is the protagonist. That's all we know about him, and it's one of his least successful movies, I feel like, in terms of just how many people connected with it or, really enjoyed it. And I don't know, that's just that there's an interesting,
that's a good point. Yeah.
Because you're right. We don't see that. We're used to getting and I think, it's this weird thing of you're like, well, why do we always want that? And you're like, well, because it usually makes things feel better and more, you feel more, and, you feel more connected to the characters. And so, it's an interesting thing to watch, and it is interesting to dissect, but like it is that thing of like, this is definitely a flavor, and I don't want all my things flavored.
Well, it would be hard to pull this particular movie off if we did get to know Popeye better, because what would we do with that?
They would have to make him a better person, or
or
give him a reason he's this way,
more, like
has a dead wife
like him
or something.
Yeah, exactly. Like what do you do?
Maybe
with
that's
that?
what they do in the second one. I don't know.
But yeah, it would be tough. And it is interesting because I think what then happens is, I mean, these characters are interesting in their own right, but as cops, and that's it, right? And so really, I think a lot of what the movie relies on is movie making, right? It relies on, I mean, I partly in a narrative sense, but really like it relies on cinematic tools more than it relies on like emotional connection. Like, again, even with Act One, the way that we constantly cut back and forth, that cross-cutting from France to New York, and then when the French characters end up in New York, we're still constantly going back and forth, which just really ratchets up the suspense, right? Because we know there's something going on. but we're never getting all of the pieces, right? So we're just getting hints of something, but we don't have all the answers, So like we know that the car is important, right? So Alain has gotten this actor, Henri, I think is his name, to come to the U.S. with the car. The car's offloaded. We know the car's important, but we don't know what's going on with it, right? So when they impound the car and they can't find the drugs, we don't know where they are either, right? And so, doing those kinds of things, and what we talked about with the camera work, and really a big part of it too is the pacing, and the editing of this movie is outstanding.
Yes.
Crazy.
So it's
It
really
feels
relying on
documentary
all
in
of
a way.
those things, right, to keep us in the movie, because you're right, we don't have that emotional investment that I think we're used to today that keeps us in movies.
There are times, first of all, just like the whip pans, the things coming in the frame and then racking to that in the foreground. Of course, like the huge like telephoto, like tracking in shots to like Gene Hackman is like always somewhere in the background watching somebody.
Yeah, or the funny ones.
It's almost a little
like,
comical, but
the ones where they're hiding, they're like tailing them, and there's one in particular where like two people are meeting in front, and then they part, and then we zoom right to a guy in a trench coat with giant binoculars just staring right at them. And you're like, it's really good they didn't just casually glance that direction.
But there are times though where I'm watching this big act two here, and I'm trying to piece together where some of the people are geography wise. Because like sometimes he's looking over his shoulder, and then it cuts to this angle, and I'm like, that doesn't actually work geography wise on how some of this works. But it's so fast, it's so energetic, there's so much movement, and what's interesting is that we don't have that emotional hierarchy in editing, so we don't really tie to anything emotional, but it still works. So it's like this weird, it's kind of bucking the things that you kind of need to kind of break space, but it's well executed that it works even without that top hierarchy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That binocular shot, by the way, is when Popeye actually loses
in Washington.
Alain, exactly,
Yes.
and they meet in DC, and then we see, okay, well, since both characters were being followed, we get that.
And that's like halfway through the second act chase sequence, right? That's before the train sequence.
Yes.
And so it is an interesting thing. Again, how this movie plays with stakes of like that whole sequence is set up by Popeye coming up and realizing both the other cops are being distracted, and this guy's walking out, and he just happens to be there. And so we're just going this really long ordeal where he's just trying not to lose this guy one time. And even if he lost him, it's funny because he does lose him and it doesn't matter. It's kind of funny. But even if he lost him, it's not like this will it's not like this is set up of like, if he loses him now, they'll never find him again, or the case is gone. Like, it is kind of this, like, the movie, I think, like you said, the filmmaking makes the stakes almost feel bigger than they are. You know what I mean? Yeah. And I think going into the very awesome, and the getting on and off of the train sequence, right before he gets away, I think it is, you think it's going to happen like 5 times before the doors actually close. You know what I mean? Because you kind of know what's going to happen, because you can tell the guy's going in and out. Like, but it happens like 5 times. And you're like,
no, it's amazing.
This time,
and not only that, but it, like, they do it once, and then they both get off the train, and then they go order.
They do a second train,
at the little juice stand or whatever, and then they go through the whole thing again. And you're thinking, there's no way this could work, and yet, like, it's so engrossing because it's executed so well. And I guess to some extent at that level, there is a little character development, in the sense that these guys are both incredibly smart. They're both really good at what they do. And so I think we get caught up in that, and like, who's going to win this little game within a game within a game, right?
Well, it's the first time they publicly acknowledge each other at the end of it. He waves it. That's the first time that he admitted he was, kind of following him, essentially.
Yeah. And that close up of him through the window on the train, Ellen, as the train goes, is fantastic. Yeah, absolutely great.
Do you know whether or not Gene Hackman did the driving in some of the wider shots? Because it looks like, maybe it's just a double, But when he gets in the car and peels out that first time, I'm like, did he really do that? Because it's really impressive if he did. And then there's these obviously they didn't have green screen, at least not what they're doing. Then they were not using green screen, right? And so there's these like track like over the shoulder shots to like the rear view mirror to like the skyline, those kind of things. And you're like, that's Gene Hackman driving. And of course, they're probably not going as fast, those kind of things, and using
Yeah.
telephoto lens, but still, it felt like he was doing most of the driving there.
And
And
some of those shots were stressful. Like even like just
Yeah.
like the camera perspective that you're going through the streets with him sometimes, you're like he almost hits the lady, you know what I mean? And like
Yeah.
they
Again,
don't
it's
spoilers. I titled the thumbnails for everybody, "Best car chase ever?" question mark.
right.
So get those
Well, it is
clicks.
interesting.
But yeah,
I don't think he did all the stunt driving, and I think a lot of the times when he's hitting other cars and stuff, I think there's probably clearly a stunt driver there. I didn't do a ton of research, but I did read a little bit, and on a lot of those things, the cars were actually supposed to barely miss, but they ended up crashing
Oh.
and they just kept going.
sounds like it worked though. You know
Yeah,
what I
exactly.
mean?
So-
It probably would have been less it would have been less chaotic if it had missed every time.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
And it is so innovative, and actually we should back up because before we even get to the car chase, I think we need to talk about, we sort of have this wonderful transition because to me that car chase really is sort of what launches Act 3. And the end of Act 2 is really fascinating because, we basically sort of have this failure, right? They don't really get the information that they need.
They're told to give it up, right?
Exactly. The captain kind of fires them from special assignment, and it feels like the end of Act 2. But in the scene right before that, Alain is worried enough about Popeye being on them that he tells his guy to take care of him, right? So it's really interesting. If he hadn't done that, they would have been fired. That would have been the end of it. But instead they're fired and you think, okay, that's the end. And then in the one shot that we get of any sense of home life, right? He's like carrying groceries seemingly
Yeah.
back to his apartment.
What a great shot. Great
And
shot.
then he gets shot at, right? And the guy's trying to kill him. And then we get our climax, and then boom, we were off and running into Act 3. He runs up into the building, finds the gun, finds the spent cartridges, sees the guy, has just run out the
I
building.
will be honest,
and the chase is on.
it was a bit of like the fact that he got down there in time
Down
to still
back,
see
yes.
the guy.
And
I was
didn't
like,
lose
come
him.
on. That guy's a real slow runner. Yeah, I
we
do
see that all the time though in movies.
You're right. It's not a big deal. I do want to bring up one interesting thing, and I think it just makes me wonder about just the context of this movie when it came out. The scene where they get fired, which is like this car crash scene, which has nothing to do with anything else in the movie and the story. We spend a lot of time there and a lot of time looking at the dead bodies that they have all kind of dressed up there, and it just makes me wonder, like, was some of the appeal of this movie at the time kind of the grotesqueness of it, like we're swearing, we're racial slurs, we're showing dead bodies, there's a lot of blood. It doesn't look very good. It's like way too red,
Really
but like but and then like some of it looks like plastic, like there's like plastic
Kool-Aid
blood.
Man being shot. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
But it just, thinking about that scene and how much time we spend looking at bodies that have nothing to do with the story. This car crash, I was almost like, we kept going back to the faces. I was like, is one of these people in the gang? And I'm like,
I
not.
think the movies almost want you to think that maybe these two people are like Sal and his girlfriend or something like that, and I think you're almost set up to believe that maybe that's the case.
Maybe so, yeah.
But then clearly it's not, and it's not over. I don't know. That's an interesting
Anyway, it
point.
just made me wonder about, like, was part of this movie's just the impact of it, just because it broke rule, it did things that other movies weren't willing to do at the time, kind of thing.
I'm sure that's a little bit of it, yeah. Because it is gritty, and we hadn't seen a lot of that grit and the ability to kind of not worry about the rating system anymore.
Well, it feels like, do we get Taxi Driver without this? You know, you want. I mean, we probably do,
Yeah,
but
maybe
like, there's a
not, but
lot of
we're at this, you know, this
inspiration
is
in
the
it.
same 2 to 3 year period that we get Midnight Cowboy, which
Mm.
I think was rated X.
Wow.
And we get Last Tango in Paris just a year or two later, which is basically pornography, you know. So we do have this period in the early 70s where for sure,
Yeah.
you know, pushing the envelope either with violence or sex, you know, was definitely happening. Absolutely. Yeah, so then we
Yeah.
get this car chase, right?
Yes.
We get this fantastic car chase. So yeah, I'm curious. Obviously, we have so much technology now that can go into car chases, and you know, then some people might argue we go too far with CGI and all that. So I'm curious, how did you guys feel about the car chase? You know, how did it
It's
hold
very
up?
stressful in an
Yeah,
effective way, in a way that
yeah.
I think it meant to be stressful. Yeah, I loved it. It felt real. It felt chaotic. It felt, you know, there's kind of like two different kind of ticking bombs, which is like, can he keep up with them, and what's going to happen on the train with the murderer. I thought it did a really good job of cutting back and forth so that like it kept it engaging. The whole we weren't ever with one of them too long, and it was a really great sequence. And you know, I loved the ending of it too, of getting him, and it's good. I liked that.
Yeah, I had again we saw this parts of this clip a lot in school, and again I had no context, so I didn't realize he was chasing a train.
Right,
And
right.
maybe I wasn't paying attention in class. I don't remember, but I do. But to me that's super interesting because it's like two different planes, right? Literally different
Mhm.
planes, and I've never seen that kind of thing done before. And yeah, I mean like what's interesting is I remember growing up a lot and my dad watching. I mean, I've seen Smoking the Bandit, I don't know how many times. My dad watched it so many times because that Trans Am, right? 1977. And so we would watch all these Fast and the Furious movies and we would watch all these things as they were coming out. And he'd be like, these movies don't hold a candle to Smoking the Bandit in terms of like the car driving sequences, right? And they're different. They earlier Fast and Furious obviously is more realistic, but it just feels more tangible when you the where you place the camera, how the camera is moving. Obviously, we know when things are visual effects or not for the most part, and then it just feels real and gritty. And I do miss that a lot of movies. I think one of the better examples that my brain thinks of immediately is the Jack Reacher with Tom Cruise. I really like the driving in that, and that's Christopher McQuarrie, which I think in the Mission Impossible movies, and of course there's CGI. A lot of those chase sequences are really well done
Right.
because they're using those same kind of ideas that French Connection is doing here, where it's real, it's gritty. Tom is actually driving or
Practical
something like
effects.
that.
Well, and
Yeah.
part
Yeah,
of the
Yeah.
spectacle is that it's actually him doing it, and they're doing it for
yes,
real. You know.
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And there's a little meta there too, and
Yeah.
I enjoy that over. I mean, and that's what's obviously people enjoy that because they released like the stunt for Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning a year before the movie comes out. Like that's the
Yeah.
before the trailers. Like he's doing this stunt, and like they build the marketing on the stunts now. So I of course there's more glamorous chase sequences I've seen before in movies that are all practical, but I had a really good time with it. And to to anyone that says like, oh, it's tame or I could do that today, it's like, yeah, good fucking luck, buddy. That's 1971, and I doubt you could probably do that today.
Yeah.
Well,
So
and I think it's true of the movie of like in some ways it's unremarkable, right? It's a car chasing a train up top, and you know it's not necessarily like, you know, it's not like it's ridiculous stunts or anything like that. But I think it is the filmmaking again that just carries it and makes it kind of, you know, tantalizing. You can't look away. You know what I mean? And I think even if you could predict what was going to happen or whatever, I think, you know, it is just the filmmaking is so good. And I don't know. It's just I'm not someone that just loves a good car chase, but I was, you know, glued to my screen the whole
Yeah.
time. You know.
one thing I want to say also that I don't think we've talked about yet, and I kept thinking about it over and over, was the lack of score throughout the movie. And
Yeah.
I think at the very end I heard score when they're in like the concrete building or whatever. And I was
A
like,
lot of
well,
the
there's
score was
score.
screeching tires. There was a
Exactly.
lot of screeching tires. Oh
Yeah,
my
and I was
god.
just kind of like, man, like to me, I I've always enjoyed the process of Foley and trying to mix sounds together and create something new that's tangible, it's more Hollywoody, whatever. And this movie does such a good job of you can't hear the dialogue half the time, and you're relying on sometimes just steam or smoke or people, like the rustling of paper and those kind of things. And I just kept finding myself going like, there's no score here right now, but like it's working though. Like it's
Yeah.
not again the balls. Like sometimes you're editing, people who don't know who are listening to the podcast, and you throw on some music because it makes you feel better because the cuts are quicker all of a sudden, and you don't feel like such a shitty filmmaker because you have some music behind it. But they didn't really do that in this movie. They're using the environment and just their again. I really respect the balls they had to do what they did.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the car chase is still really fantastic. And I think one of the things that I think there's two things that make it really good. Well, there's a lot of things, but two things I want to mention. One is that it does increase the stakes. I mean, Popeye obviously is not afraid to kind of rough people up, and he shoots a guy without really thinking, and it turns out to be a fellow cop. But like,
Well, FBI agent,
or FBI agent. But yeah, but he's trying not to kill people, right? He's trying not to hit things and hit people. And today when we see car chases, like none of that really seems to matter, it's just about, oh, we can flip this car, oh, we see the car flying out. I mean, I remember you mentioned Fast and Furious, and they're doing a car chase, and then she's got the device where all the cars are like driving out of the parking garages. I mean, and hundreds of people are getting killed, and we don't bat an eye. Like we lose track of, like it's not real anymore because it's just we're killing so many people left and right that we don't even care anymore. It's just about the spectacle and the thrill. But it's funny because we said like there's not a lot of emotional stakes to the movie. We don't know these characters, but in that chase, like everything matters, right? I mean, it's like at any moment he could hit and kill somebody, and the movie makes you feel that and makes you worried that that's going to happen, right? And so I think the stakes feel high on that level. And then the fact that he's chasing a subway train, I think, is genius. And I don't know that anyone's come up with something to parallel that, because when someone's in anything else, another car, a motorcycle, whatever, they can't do anything else other than just drive the car, right? But because he's chasing this subway car, the guy can do all of these things on the subway, right? He's got a gun. He can threaten people. He eventually he kills a cop on the subway. He then goes and puts a gun to the driver's head, and so it's fascinating that we can have a chase where it's almost like two different things are happening within the chase, whereas normally with a chase, both characters are basically doing the same thing. I mean, one's running and one's chasing, but they can't really do anything else. And so the fact that the bad guy Pierre can do all of these other things on the train just makes it feel so alive. It's like, what's he going to do next? How many people is he going to kill? How is this going to end? Like, how does he get off the train? What's going to happen with the train? Like, I mean, it's just such a great idea and so well executed. And then, of course, the train crashes, and we haven't mentioned this yet, but we get another sort of controversial moment with Popeye, right? He shoots the guy in the back,
Right.
Which is one of the more famous shots of the movie as well.
Yeah, it's the poster. Without knowing that he killed the people on the train.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of like he did, which we kind of, some people I'm sure be like, oh, that guy deserves it. He was just killing innocent people, blah, 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 right? But then it's like, he definitely didn't know that he was doing those things. I did a little research, and apparently a lot of police around the country weren't a super big fan of that, I guess.
Yeah.
It was misrepresenting them and what you're supposed to do.
But they would not do that, yeah.
Yeah, and I guess the director said that that's what the character he was based on would have done.
Exactly.
And so anyway, very interesting. I think it lines up exactly with what the character does so far, and
it's interesting. I mean, like I agree with you. There's one part of your analysis that I would only take small issue with, Bruce, is that like I'm not sure if Popeye cares about hitting people as much as he cares about not being able to follow the train. The only time I feel like he actually avoids someone to not kill them is the baby, and the every other time
Yeah.
it's a car because it's in the way, and he's like, "Get out of the way, get out of the
Well,
way."
that's true.
And,
That's
and you know,
true.
and so I do think it is interesting because like to me, him killing him that wasn't a part of the case. It was because he got shot at because that guy tried to kill Popeye, and it's
Right.
like this is in some ways it's revenge. You know what I mean? Like you
Yeah,
just
but
tried to assassinate me.
I don't think Doyle. He's not.
In theory,
He-
Popeye
he-
didn't even know he was a part of the case. How would he know?
I know, but he
Like
he doesn't.
I know
I don't
movie
think
logic, but like
I know. I don't think he is. He at least knows. At least he thinks he's doing the right thing, right? First of all.
killing
Second
him?
of all,
I don't know.
I mean,
I think
mean,
that's
like,
just he wants
I
to
think
do it. He's pissed at him.
I know. I think he thinks that if he was shot at, I think he thinks he's doing the right thing.
But shooting
But
an unarmed man in the back, like I don't think in that moment he was like, "Yes, this is the most policey thing to do. This is the
I don't think.
honorable thing to do."
I think he was thinking it was okay, but to me, I don't think he's someone that. Yes, he does disregard. I think Muldridge at the end. He also really didn't like him already. I don't think he's just going. If it was like a female or a baby instead, I don't think it would have been the same exact reaction. I think it would have been close, but I'm saying like he's not like a 100% a bad guy. He's a bad guy, yes. I'm not trying to, but I'm saying he's not someone who is just going to go out and just murder women and children and other innocent men just because they're
He
in his
slams
way.
on the brakes, which slows him down.
Yes.
Having said that, if he had actually run them down, would
I don't know if he
have
would have stopped.
Maybe not. Yeah, he might have kept going.
Like,
Yeah, I don't know.
And I'm
I
saying,
don't
I'm
know
saying,
either, but-
I think he thinks he has a somewhat of a code. You know, again, like this is all. There's also little tinge there of like FBI versus cop, and it's
Sure.
kind of like this very. You know, what I'm saying I'm not saying it's right, nothing like that. I'm just saying I don't think that. I think he's got a somewhat of a
I
code.
agree
It's
with
just
you.
not a
I
code.
think he-
And a
I
code
think-
that
but I think the code
think
is
he
you
has a
shot at me.
code.
I'm allowed to kill you. Doesn't matter where you are. You shot at me. I can kill
Yeah,
you now.
think so.
But I don't think that's not the police code.
No,
His
I
superiors
don't think
wouldn't have
so.
said that was a
No.
Yeah,
all
that's what
I'm
I'm
saying
saying,
is
yeah.
like to me it's like it's just interesting that like that whole scene in his mind he would have never I mean maybe he heard the guy say something in French at one point but other than that there's no this is just motherfucker started sniping at me, so I had to get him. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And
I mean,
like
he can
that. I like
probably
it.
do a little bit of assuming that he's following these people in the case. And all of a sudden, he
Of
starts
course, of
fixing to be
course.
killed.
We
I think
should-
there's
we
probably
should-
some.
yeah. We should
Also, I don't.
point out. We should
What
also
kind of
point
gun
out-
was being used? Was
We
it a
should
French
also point
gun?
out one other thing, which I think is supposed to be a big part of what's happening, which is that he is clearly injured to some extent from the battering he has taken in
Yes.
the car, because the guy is limping up
Yeah,
the stairs, and as
Like
Hackman goes
leans.
around to the stairs, he falls into the railing,
Yeah.
and you get the idea that he might think that he doesn't have the strength to get up and continue the chase.
I agree. That's
And
true.
so they give him that too. Now, again, does that fully justify shooting him in the back? No, of course not. Not in the real world. But it does factor into, I think, how we view Popeye and what his mental calculation is in terms of whether he's going to shoot the guy. Because, of course, in shooting him, he loses a lot of information, right? I mean, he's not stupid. If he'd been able to arrest this guy, he would have gotten probably a lot more information and maybe close the case much more successfully than he was able to do. So I think that's the out that the movie gives him a little, but yeah, I mean, it's not like it's a full out for sure.
Anyway, great scene.
Yeah.
Great action. And I do like how like calm it gets at the point of the shooting or like right before it. Like it gets very quiet. They're just slowly walking. Even Gene can kind of just slowly there's still suspense there because you're just like, is he gonna see Gene just casually watching him?
Yeah.
Walk out of this thing.
I did really like that moment too, because it's kind of like I see him, but he doesn't see me, so I can take my time to intercept him a little bit. But also, there's another thing too, though. Like the guy tried to kill him, and it's those things too. Like if he gets away, I'm not trying to defend him. I'm just saying like they kind of do give you some kind of things to kind of think about, because it's kind of like if he gets away, then he's a cop. Like theoretically, he would be the person you would call to report this. And so.
Well,
yeah, I
sure. There's
think
definitely a thought of could this guy kill other people
or
and
kill or try to kill me
yeah,
again. I mean, he
right,
tried
right.
once,
Yeah,
so it's
yeah,
like I'm not defending it, obviously, but you know, yeah, it's a little complicated, but
yeah,
yeah,
yeah. Um, one of the things I really like, just from a storytelling point of view, is what happens after that, which is that we never have a scene where the captain reassigns them to the case. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and it might seem obvious, but I think a lot of filmmakers would have felt like they needed that scene. But it's completely obvious. A bad guy
Yes.
tried to kill him. It seems pretty obvious that the bad guy,
Well, the
is
captain was
connected
saying
to
there's
this
no case
case.
here. They're not, they're not what you think they are. They're not bad guys. They're not doing this. And he's like, well, once you get a tide to attack, well, you can't argue with that. Yeah,
Exactly,
yeah.
exactly. And so the movie just dispenses with that, and it's like,
I
yeah,
like
of
that.
course the case continues, and we're not even going to worry about that. And then we actually cut, I think, to Sal and Angie, and then and then we sort of continue, right? We continue the back and forth, and then we get this whole next set piece, which is the car, right? Which is following the car and then trying to
yeah.
figure out what the hell's going on with the car. I will say there was one thing. I'm curious whether you guys were confused by this too. Um, Buddy is following the guy who goes down into the parking garage, and then they end up running into each other, and he sort of lies and he says that
Looking for the guy. Yeah.
he's looking for the guy or whatever. And so the guy gets in the car. That guy, I do not think is Sal, but looks almost identical to Sal. And I was wondering whether you guys were confused by what happened in that moment, because Sal is buying the drugs from the French, right? So it's the French who should be delivering the car with the drugs in it for Sal's people to pick up and then would, exchange the money. So I don't think the guy is Sal. He's a little scruffier than Sal seems to be, but they look almost identical. So I'm like, is that Sal? Why would Sal be delivering the drugs that he's buying for his own people? It was sort of weird. I don't know. Did you guys get thrown off by that at all, or
I did not.
I
okay?
didn't notice it wasn't. Honestly,
But
I
I
just
think
felt
I
like there were
was,
several bad guys that kind of had that look.
yeah,
Like kind of
that's why.
moppy, black
Yeah.
hair, greasery
Right?
look.
Sideburns.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so it was just kind of like, oh, it's one of them. It's one of the
Yeah.
group that all look
Yeah,
like
it's like
that.
that's a bad guy. Yeah.
Well, also it's interesting because after he drops off the car, he gets into Angie's car, which makes you also
Yeah,
think
you're
it
right.
must
You're
be
right.
Sal.
I guess I probably did assume it was Sal. I
But
probably
it doesn't
did.
really make any sense for it to be Sal.
No.
I
And
don't remember.
And why would
I
Angie be
tried to
picking?
compare them, and I don't think it's
Why
Sal.
why would
Man,
Angie be picking up a French person? I mean, I guess that they
she's
could have
part of
arranged
the
that.
plan overall. Maybe it
Sure.
is Sal, but then I don't understand why Sal would be delivering the drugs, because he's buying the drugs. So why would he be delivering the drugs? It's all a little strange. So maybe it's a little plot hiccup, or maybe it's just a weird moment of casting. I just figure that Angie is. I mean, they're still working with the French, and so Angie's just sort of part of the whole thing. But I did get thrown off by that, and I had to go back and kind of try to figure it out, and I couldn't figure out for sure if they were the same person or not. Um, but yeah, but then we get this whole scene in the chop shop at the cop place, right, where they take the whole car apart trying to find the drugs.
Some great shots in this sequence.
I really,
Um,
yeah, it gave me anxiety because it sounds miserable taking apart that vehicle. But I love the last line. He was like, "Oh, come on, man! Like the one thing you didn't check, like, I did like that a lot." Yeah,
yeah.
It felt a
Yeah,
little convenient of Scheider just sitting there looking at his paper and like, oh, 120 pounds. That felt a little scripty, plotty, but I'll give it to him.
If there is a bit of a weakness, I agree, because like there's a point where they have the hood open, and like
Yeah.
there's the holes, and they're like running wires through there to see if there's any drugs in there, but you didn't think that, like,
Yeah.
the rocker, which is much larger, might be able to hold some drugs. Like, it didn't occur to you to think about that.
I was almost hoping, and it's interesting that it didn't. I mean, in some ways, this is Popeye's scene, right? But he he's not the reason they figure it out. He doesn't save the day or anything. I was kind of expecting that because like they're looking, and then we have this great shot of like the car being raised and revealing Popeye just looking like just dejected and just kind of like giving up. And it's like, and he's the one like, I'm telling you it's dirty. I'm telling you it's dirty. And then you'd think maybe, oh, he's gonna be, and then no, it's just like these other guys. But it is a really, I agree. It's a little bit of like manufactured like conflicts, just like, let's make them not find it and then find it, right at the last second. Yeah. And we're kind of used to that, but it does work. And I think, it is still really fun when they find it and the look on Popeye's face, you know what I mean? Like that just look of satisfaction.
That he was right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And maybe it makes sense that Buddy is the one who actually like reads paperwork and
sure. The one that actually pays attention to the details.
Actually like maybe does a little sleuthing versus just sort of running around chasing people all the time, which is primarily what Popeye does. He's very good at it, but maybe that's part of the idea. So of course this, then they're very clever, right? They actually give the car back, Well, it seems like it would have taken way longer to put the car back together.
The Wikipedia says it's a duplicate or it's a lookalike.
Yeah. So, see, I thought it was at first like there's no fucking way they put this car back together. It looked like this.
Okay.
Unless it's
Wikipedia
just being like really dishonest with the cross cutting. And it's like this happened this morning and this is happening late afternoon. We're just not telling you.
It's interesting that Wikipedia says that. I don't remember anything in the movie.
I didn't either.
I guess it's just the practicality of it that
exactly.
They're depicting this as if it's happening simultaneously.
Yeah.
I mean, what Sal comes in there at one point, or Popeye comes in the room at one point, right? When they're
and they run into each other, right?
After they find it, or at some point right towards the end, he like sees it. So like, it's happening simultaneously. So it's still impressive they wrote to like take apart that car and put all those bags in there.
Yeah. So then we have our big ending, and of course, we probably could criticize a little bit because they let the guy get in his car and he goes over the bridge and then there's a blockade, but they don't block the other side.
I was expecting I kept being like, he's gonna go back and there's another blockade, right? Like they're gonna have another one, right? Like or like
one have a big shootout, yeah.
And then it's like he goes over and it's like 5 minutes later, the police are going in single file because the way they parked, they weren't going to be able to drive immediately out of there. They had to park themselves out of that blockade.
There is one thing I want to kind of jump back a little bit to the midpoint here. I think exactly the midpoint of the movie is when they have that chemist and he is like looking at the quality of the drug.
Interesting character, yeah.
Yeah, and to me, it felt like that moment made everything feel real. Like it's the first time we see the drugs, and it was kind of like the Nakatomi getting head blown off moment, but just midpoint. And I was like, oh, like this is now we've been hearing about drugs, and now we're finally seeing it for the first time at the midpoint, and then the rest of the movie becomes that other mode, right? But anyway, I thought that was interesting. I forgot to mention that earlier.
Yeah.
But yeah, there should have been a blockade, especially if you're standing, if you're like in your car waiting, it makes sense kind of. If you're standing outside, you're like, whoa, yeah.
Why they even let him drive away? Like just surround them to begin with.
I don't know.
There was also another point, and maybe this is another kind of confusing thing that I'm just remembering. I think this happened earlier, maybe when they got fired from the case. He said it had been going on for 2 months. Right? Like he'd been following these guys for 2 months. So that the events of this movie were 2 months long. And it's like,
it does feel way
you could have fooled me. Like I don't feel like they telegraphed that enough in any way, really.
I guess we're just supposed to get the idea that the
tailing sections
tailing is taking much longer than we think it is. But I agree. It didn't feel like 2 months to me either.
And then this other character, obviously they have in like this, I guess, French actor or whatever he is, the guy that is being used to bring over the stuff. Right. He's a really interesting component of this, just in terms of like, he's this mule that, is somewhat unwittingly. But even at the end, his like, it's just, he gets brought up in the epilogue, and it's like all these people are like released, reduced sentence, got off 4 years for this guy. It was just an interesting, like, what does this character represent in the like? He just felt like he got a significant amount of attention, and then he got like we got an epilogue of what happened to him afterwards, and it just is like it's interesting what
Are
this
you
character is representing, or like the
are you talking about
French
the
dude,
guy who's like he's like I need one more favor to that guy? That guy?
Yeah, he's the
the
actor.
actor, the
Yeah,
guy that
well,
wants the
he's
car, the guy that's waiting for the
yeah.
car in the garage,
Right.
and it's like, you have my car.
He's based off an actor, I guess, who had been involved in some drug stuff, who did go to prison for a few years. So like
Okay,
that
so
kind of was
maybe it's just
somewhat
realism. Yeah.
Well, it
yeah,
also,
a little
but it
bit.
also makes sense. It makes sense logically, and it actually makes sense thematically too, because so first of all, there's this guy that we
Sure.
barely meet. I even forget. I've got his name written down here somewhere. Weinstock or whatever, right? Who's the one
The mob dude for New
who's
York.
working
Yeah.
with Sal, right?
His boss, it seems like Sal's boss.
Yeah, and who is the one who's telling him like, oh, we don't have to move so fast on the
Yeah,
deal,
yeah.
and so he gets off completely, right?
Yeah.
And it makes sense because there's almost nothing that ties him to
Right.
the case,
That's
right?
how it always
So
happens.
he's
right.
very so that makes sense. Obviously, Alain gets away, so it makes sense that he's not charged with anything. But the one thing we know is we can track this car, right? We know the
Yeah.
car was on the boat. They probably have all the information, license plates and everything. They know that the guy brought it on the boat, and they found drugs in the car. So the one person that they have a solid case against is this guy, because he brought a bunch of drugs over to the United States in a car. So I do think it makes sense logically. And then, of course, thematically, I think one of the things you see so often in movies in the 70s is powerful figures getting away with stuff, right? And we've got the Watergate era, and we've got sort of these conspiracy theories.
Well, this is the height of the New York Mafia, right? Like
yeah,
they're in
and
power right now.
so I think you
the
can
70s.
go to Chinatown a couple of years later. You could go to like what's the movie? There's a couple of them. One's by Alan Pakula, where we've got Warren Beatty being chased around, and then we've got the other one with Robert Redford. I'm blanking on both of these movies, but
There's Condor. Is that one of them?
Day of the Condor is one of them, and the Parallax Effect is the other one.
Okay.
And sort of like these shadowy government figures that are after these people, and like they just sort of get away with things, like the people never sort of figure things out or escape it. So Chinatown may be the perfect example. The bad guy gets away with it, and the final line is like, hey Jake, that's Chinatown. And I think there's a little sense of that here. Sort of this bleakness of like the biggest guys, the biggest fish, they get away. They get away with it. They just sort of vanish, into the night. They stop the drug deal from happening, so there's some success. But kind of like you alluded to earlier, they arrest some of the lower level people, and kind of the patsy, the one guy who's just sort of like not really involved, but needs the money, is the one who gets the big sentence, and everyone else gets off, and a number of people die, and it's all kind of for nothing. And that feels very 70s. I think that's very thematically a part of what we would see, especially in the first half of the 70s.
Yeah, it's not the kind of ending that I would ever want out of a movie, just because I like my happy endings, as you guys know. But
Yeah.
I think obviously it's thematic, and it like you said, it's all for nothing. I think that's the best way to put it. And it makes you think, yeah.
Yeah, it's another very strong parallel with The Wire, right? Of like a
Yeah.
show where it's like it's about like problems and systems, and it's about people that try to change them but don't.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah,
And it's in some ways it's about that this is a pattern that even like there are always people that try to fix it and they never do. But
It's because they need to be fixed first before they can fix the bigger problem. That's the problem.
exactly. We need to fix them. We should fix them with our movies so then they can be fixed.
Well, I'm saying like
I'm kidding.
I mean, some of these things wouldn't inherently be the way if they are, obviously, if Gene Hackman maybe operated differently, or if
Sure,
so, like,
absolutely. I mean, there's a version of this where like if he's a more in control of his emotions, and they can, they keep their cover longer, or they, are able to catch them in a sting that doesn't lose any lives or anything like that. So I think you're right. I think it is, it's just this really, and I think that again, that's why it feels so real. It's just this really complicated world with gray characters that are constantly kind of messing up or just not making the ideal choice in situations, and then we're kind of getting domino effects out of that, and we just I think it was surprising ending. It was just, especially just when he runs down the hallway and you hear a gunshot.
Right.
And then you just go straight, and you're just like
straight into,
I don't even get to see what the gunshot was about. Like that, like, and it's like this weird thing of like, he just killed the FBI agent, like unloaded his clip into him, reloads it, turns a corner, gunshot, epilogue credits. And you're just like, what? Yeah. But upon reflection, you're like, well, kind of fits with the rest of the movie. You know what I mean? It kind of makes sense. It kind of goes with the flow. It's a frustrating movie, kind of. You know what I mean?
You're not supposed to feel satisfied at all. Yeah.
I mean, Gene Hackman is a frustrated man with every part of his life, and is constantly being frustrated by the parts of this case that keep messing up. I don't know. It's good.
And that final gunshot is so interesting because you assume someone is dead. Right,
has to be right.
But
Either
it
Gene,
turns out neither of them.
I was
dead.
Expecting Gene to be okay, maybe Gene Hackman dies. You know,
exactly, but neither of them's dead, and
we don't find out till the next movie, I guess, that both of them are alive.
Well, and the epilogue obviously tells us Alan disappeared.
Oh, sure, yes, and then they were transferred. You're right.
Right.
Yes,
which I guess leads you to believe that he just turned the corner and kept firing, just
saw someone and
just shot,
and that this like well-to-do French man in a trench coat was able to like hide in a freaking warehouse long enough to evade police. That's old 60-year-old.
I do got to give you the tagline on the poster for French Connection 2. It's the French Connection was only the beginning. This is the climax. So there you go.
Interesting. I've never seen the second one. I guess I need to watch it at some point.
I watched the trailer earlier, and it's like Doyle's in France or Paris or something, and so it's kind of like he fish out of water, but he's still doing the Doyle thing. So
right,
I was like reading the synopsis a little bit earlier, and I was like, wow, this one goes like they're like capturing him and drugging him, and they really I don't know. It does seem like, but it seems very in line with it's just. More of the same of Doyle being kind of a wrecking ball. He's just in a different china shop this time.
Yeah. Well, I mean, in the end, it is, I think it's a classic, and it holds up. You mentioned Gene Hackman winning Best Actor. I mean, we should also mention it won Best Picture, it won Best Director, it won Best Screenplay, it also won Best Actor. I mean, that kind of sweep is really rare. Roy Scheider was nominated and didn't win. I actually didn't check to see. It won 5 nominations. I
think it won editing also, right?
That would make sense to me.
Best editing. Yep.
Yeah. So I mean, winning Best Picture, Best Director, Best Screenwriter, and Best Actor, or Best Screenplay and Best Actor. I mean, that is a sweep. That is a sweep. Which I think obviously means that the movie was recognized at the time for like how innovative and powerful it was, and so the quality is still there. Like you said, there might be some things about it that modern audiences might not be used to and might have less patience for, but there's no doubt the quality is there.
Yeah, it's that thing of like 70s movies that like the sound design is always pretty rough, especially if you're listening on any kind of modern system. There was a part of me that was like, man, what if they just like remastered the ADR? There were just certain things where I'm like watching and like this guy's walking up clearly concrete steps, but they sound metal. And I'm like, okay. Yeah. But it's like, it is that thing of like honestly, the times the realism were undercut was just kind of the technology at the time, not anything they were doing wrong. You know what I mean? And I do want to, I like the editing, and I thought just like the use of inserts of just getting random people doing random things, especially towards the beginning of the movie, just felt so like the pacing was so nice and just just so intentional, and just giving us these little pops of like anecdotal little vignettes of like someone on the docks or someone, smoking a cigarette or whatever. It was just all really just, it had a fantastic flow to it.
Yeah,
I was very jealous of all the extras, like in the bar scene, the club at the beginning. So I'm always like, man, because you forget, like when you're watching, like those are all paid extras, hopefully. And I was like, man, it must be so nice to have so many extras just show up on set. Must feel good. Let's just anyway, I really liked it. I think the biggest hurdle for modern day audiences is the abruptness at the end. I think if they were enjoying it all the way up to the end, that cut at the end and those title cards, I think people would walk out and disregard the experience they were having and like be upset they didn't have any type of closure.
Is
So
there any kind of was that the planned ending the whole time? Or is there a version
don't
of this
know.
where like
I don't
they
know.
had a different one written, production issues got in the way, and they just had to pivot kind of thing? Because it does feel so abrupt that you're like, it works, but there's also other endings that also could have worked that wouldn't have been so
Yeah.
abrupt, I
Yeah.
think, you know?
well, I think sometimes mistakes are confused as art, and this may be a case of that. So I don't know.
Oh.
I think, like I never would have ended the movie that way in a million years, but also I don't know. People look at it and be like, "Oh, it's brilliant," and maybe it is. I don't know. Yeah,
Good film.
All
Good,
right,
good
yeah.
film. I enjoyed it.
We should just cut the podcast right there.
we should have. We should have.
And then just put subtitles. So
Yeah.
like
Yeah, yeah.
next time, Daniel Donovan and Bruce reviewed this movie.
Well,
Or no, we should have made a gunshot effect go off.
There you go.
we should have.
You can
We
still do
still,
that.
we still can
There's
technically.
time
Yeah.
to cut all of this
Yeah,
out.
yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, overall, I really enjoyed it. I thought it was I call it a treat to be reminded of even hey, I watched Deadpool Wolverine 3 times and I'm gonna watch it at least 2 more times in theaters, probably. But it is nice to get a movie like this where there isn't there's not this like there's no pressure around it. First of all, there's no pressure for it to be good, to follow all these other things. It's also like it's trying to tell a very specific thing and it's trying to get you from A to B, and you don't have to worry about all the math behind it. And it's also nice to see people who are doing something really well with their craft, and
Yeah.
especially in a day where where it feels like more and more so every year we're losing what I consider the art of filmmaking in a lot of ways. And maybe I'm just getting older and like more cranky. I don't know, but I liked watching this kind of thing, and it made me want to go back. And this has always been in the back of my head, like this movie, but I've never like done it yet. And so now I'm like, man, I need to go back and watch some other things. And also one that keeps coming to my brain that I've seen before, but it's been like 20 years. I want to go back and watch Ronin now and rewatch it. And so anyway, I really appreciate you mentioning this one, and I'm glad we got to watch it.
I think there is something cool about specifically about that time period of
I
like
agree.
67 to 75, where again, with that new Hollywood cinema, it was sort of like the studio system was kind of falling apart a little bit. People weren't going to the movies. We had this influence of the French New Wave and this European cinema. And so we had this period of kind of studio style experimentation where people were just we had the craftsmanship, but we also just had kind of people trying new things and being original. And then, of course, you just got the 70s as a very interesting time, where it does feel like a different world, but it doesn't feel. It's like the beginning of contemporary times in a way, you know what I mean? Because
it's like this is about as early as you can get, and the movie still kind of recognizable to our style of storytelling, right? Like go much before this, and it's really feeling like
kind of stuff.
the acting, especially.
After Donald Sutherland died, whatever that was, a month ago, I went back and watched Clute with him and Jane Fonda, another great 70s movie, and they're so fun to watch, and they're different, but they're still kind of relatable, versus watching like a 40s or 50s movie, which can be fun, but feels like a different world, almost a different art form in a way.
It does. They feel more theatrical.
Right. Yeah. And then when you get these 70s movies, there's just something really cool about them. It's a fun time to go back to, and probably a lot of sort of buried classics maybe that we're forgetting about a little bit. And the French Connection maybe being one of them, and I think that's one of the cool reasons, for us to have revisited it is, it's such a high quality movie. But maybe it's a movie that, other than maybe you hear about that car chase in film school, people aren't really going, oh, that's a classic. I mean, even movies like Chinatown, and Chinatown's more complicated, is directed by Roman Polanski, who has a whole lot of baggage
Yep.
to him as a person.
Now, yeah.
But it's starting to get to that point. Those movies are 50 plus years old now, and maybe they're starting to slip out of our consciousness a little bit, but they're still part of what I would consider the beginnings of our contemporary period of cinema. So yeah,
I mean, you
it's
still,
great that we
again,
got a
you
chance to do
feel
it. Yeah.
the French connections, I feel like impact still today, or like
Yeah,
that,
for sure.
that style of filmmaking
Right.
that you're seeing kind of make its debut at this time. You know what I mean? Again, and I think not only the filmmaking, but the style of story, this gritty, there's no heroes. There's only just kind of great characters.
Right.
We're going to depict something that's, taboo, and we're going to have, I don't know. I think it is, again, I was surprised. Again, I know I'm coming into a cop movie. I know I'm coming into, a thriller, a chase kind of movie, but to feel it to have it feel to feel like I kind of got a taste of what maybe New York City life was like in the 70s, or like
absolutely.
cop life was like. That's even just at like there's almost just like a meta level as a human. That's just really fascinating, to get. And I think even the handheld shots of when he's like walking around in the subway, especially, you got those neon lights and stuff like that. There's just something that, again, it's that almost feels recognizable too. You're like, oh yeah, neon lights. Those weren't around too much earlier than the 70s, right? Like neon was pretty, or maybe 30, 40 years. Anyway, it still is like, has those elements where you're just like, yeah, that kind of reminds me of today. So I think it is a fascinating film. I'm really glad you recommended it to us, because I don't know if I ever would have watched it. Cool. And I'm really glad that I did.
Earlier, Bruce, you mentioned Robert Redford movie, and I mentioned Condor. The only reason I knew that is 3 Days of Condor, I guess. 3 Days of Condor. The reason I knew that.
Condor. Did I say the Day of the Condor?
No, you said it right,
so.
or I don't know.
Anyway, I just said Condor is all I said. But anyway, the only reason I knew that was because during the press junket for The Winter Soldier, the Russo brothers constantly referenced Robert Redford because he was in the movie, but also 3 Days of Condor, 3 Days of the Condor. And they mentioned French Connection. Like they were mentioning these like 70s political thrillers and like cops thrillers. And so like, in my opinion, if someone said The Winter Soldier is the best like MCU movie period, I'd be like, I can't argue with you, right? I'm not saying it's as good as the French Connection, nothing like that. I'm just saying the best filmmakers are the ones that go back and look at some of the things that I think a lot of filmmakers are just forgetting about. And now we're getting filmmakers who are copying filmmakers from the 90s and 2000s, and they were, I'm saying, like you're kind of regurgitating things that are like been regurgitated 8 times by now. But like the Russo brothers are, again, they're making superhero movies, whatever, but they at least are smart enough to they're smart enough to go back and look at what works and like take inspiration, and I think it's a really valuable lesson for modern day people that they should be doing.
Yeah, absolutely. I think all the great filmmakers, whether they're in the MCU or whether they're more auteur filmmakers, the best filmmakers know their history. They go back, they do their research, they look at the old movies, and they're really thinking. So that's really cool to hear about the Russo brothers.
Apparently, David Fincher has cited that French Connection is one of the biggest influences on Seven. And Brad Pitt even said the only reason he did Seven was because of the French Connection.
Wow.
You know what I mean? So, there's
funny enough.
And again, talking about gray characters and cops and a grungy, gritty world, there's some parallels.
Well, look at this though.
One
of the big influence on Civil War, the Russo brothers also directed. They kept in the press junket kept referencing David Fincher. So like it just shows you how like right there
the genealogy tree,
Well, just how it works,
and I think one of the really cool things to do, is like you're interested in something, so you go back and research it, and you go, okay, I really like this person. I love David Fincher, so I'm going to go look back at David Fincher. But ideally, you don't stop there, right? You then research, well, who is David Fincher's influences? What films influence him? And then you go back and you look at those, and then maybe you even go further. Well, who influenced that person, who influenced William Friedkin, and then you go back and that's how you learn, and that's how you figure it all out. So yeah, I'm glad you brought that up.
Well, what a treat for us when we were doing Raised in Arizona to see that line to Edgar Wright. You know what I'm saying? So like just there alone is, it's invaluable, I think, for people who are just trying to get better at their craft or just even talk about the craft in general.
Yeah.
And I think it's healthy to remind ourselves that, there's certain parts of filmmaking that we take for granted, like they're new, like, oh, this is what modern movies are. But like, really, a lot of these things have been going on a long time, and
Very
they've
long
been
time.
making movies like this a long time. They just maybe not have been top of zeitgeist, you know what I mean?
Right.
But you know, in some, I think it's sometimes fun to realize that some things we take for granted as new, granted as new, or as well, this is how we do modern things. I've actually been around a while.
Sure.
Which is cool.
Bruce, I think it was a couple podcasts ago, but we were talking about your Substack. So can you tell our listeners how they can find your Substack and how they can support you and all the cool things you do?
Absolutely. You could just go to the hutchfiles.com, and you can find my more detailed breakdowns of all the movies we discuss, as well as a lot of other ones that we don't, and I keep adding more. So yeah, the hutchfiles.com. And because it's on Substack, you could subscribe to that like an email newsletter. So if you do go to that, just put in your email address. And every time I post a new thing, you'll just get a drop in your email, and you can go check it out if you want.
I think we were doing a podcast and I brought up Whiplash or something. And then Daniel's like, yeah, Bruce's email. And I was like, oh, so you got it too. So like we were both like, we didn't know.
Yeah,
we were both
I read
subscribed.
your Whiplash one. It was really
Okay. Yeah,
it was
fun.
great. It was great.
Yeah, I like that because another great movie and movie we dissected in class. So I like getting kind of a different version of your analysis of that movie.
Cool.
Yeah.
Daniel, how can listeners write into us?
Listeners, you can write into bit.ly/241mail and let us know what you think of The French Connection. Maybe you've seen it. Maybe you needed to pause this podcast in the beginning and go watch it, and now you've caught up and watched it with us. We'd love to know what you think. Any other, I feel like there's probably some more direct lines we can draw between this movie and a lot of other modern movies and franchises. So if you have any ideas of those or seeing some connections we don't see, write in bit.ly/241mail.
And of course, you can always find us in the comment section below, youtube.com/@241studios. Guys, we're on the road to episode 241. So we're getting there.
Oh,
So
wow.
once we hit it, we're retiring. That's my.
No, then we got to go to 2,400.
Oh, okay, gotcha. Okay, it's good to know. I'm glad I'm locked in for a while. Yeah.
Luckily,
Anyway,
numbers are infinite, so we're good.
that's true.
We're good.
We're good. We're good. Well, Bruce, of course, I'm always appreciative for you being on the podcast, and I love seeing you last weekend as well. And I hope that we can. I know school's starting up, but hopefully we can find some time in the next couple months or so to do another cool movie. And
Absolutely.
I'm excited about it. I'm really excited. Maybe I wish we could all watch Alien Romulus together because we just broke down Alien for our listeners.
Yeah.
And I'm curious to see how that movie turns out. So just because we've been,
It's interesting because I was on either side of you at Deadpool, and I got very different. No, it looks great. I don't know. I don't think it looks. You know what I mean? So it's as like a newbie to the Alien universe, and like kind of like still learning from like you guys who have been like entrenched in it for so long. It seems like it's a bit divisive on the end, like what people are thinking how it could be. So I mean, that's
you
interesting.
need to watch Alien 3. Like I would love for us to watch Alien 3 sometime. Talk about that too. It's also interesting.
It's a David Fincher movie.
It does. That's a
first.
David Fincher movie. That's
I'm not
his
sure
first
it's
one.
the David Fincher movie we should do. We haven't done a Fincher movie yet, have we?
I don't think so, but
I would love to do Seven.
We should do a Fincher movie.
Or
That'd be a
Seven.
crazy
Or what
one
about-
to do as our first one, though.
Oh, I
would
do,
be.
but I do love Zodiac so much. I would love
so
to
many.
do
Yeah,
things
we'll
It's a
about
perfect
that.
movie.
Well, let's debate it on text because I would love to do a Fincher movie.
I would too. That's you can't. Yeah, that's like right up my alley, 100%. Alrighty, guys. Well, hey, it's always fun time as always. My name is Donovan Thompson,
I'm Daniel Wingfield.
I'm Bruce Hutchinson.
and we have spoken.